Good morning, friends. Prepared Suburbanite back at you. Today is the 25th of October, so keep in mind there's only 2 more shopping months till Christmas, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. Have you ever heard the term confirmation bias? Well, it's come up recently in a very weird kind of a discussion with somebody that I know that's way over on the left-hand side of pretty much every political statement, argument, or trend in this country. So I want to kind of talk about what that confirmation bias really is. So here's the deal. There was a discussion about abortion, probably mostly triggered by the recent Supreme Court decision that overthrew Roe versus Wade. And the question was basically, when does life begin? And I think it's important to know that I'm very conservative. I don't think abortion has any place in society, and I might be willing to make certain exceptions under some very extreme and extraordinary circumstances, but beyond that, never. So when the discussion got around to when does life begin? The response was it begins at birth. And my position is that life begins at conception. And I used a Bible quote that, and I can't remember exactly who said it. It came from the Old Testament, but it was, it may have been Joshua, that said, I knew you when you were in the womb. Well, that means that if God knew him in the womb, that life began a lot sooner in the whole cycle than than at the time of birth. So this particular individual then decided to make her point by quoting at least 15 other Bible references to the breath of life, and it was all around that's when life begins. And of course, a baby doesn't breathe until after it's born, so her 15 biblical references were all about simply life can only begin when God says it begins, and that's when he gives the gift of breath at the time of birth. And there were at least 15 different references, and I looked at them all, and they really didn't say exactly what her point was. It didn't reinforce her point. And that's what I mean about confirmation bias. She was so concerned and so convinced that life could only begin at the moment of birth that was not willing to ever consider anything that, any alternative to that it could begin at conception, it could begin with the first heartbeat, it could begin at a whole bunch of different ways that people have decided to try to define when life begins. To me, it's very simple. Life begins at conception. To her, very simple. In her mind, life begins when the baby begins to breathe, and that can only happen after birth. That is confirmation bias. She has convinced herself that abortion is okay because the baby, the fetus, the unborn child is not alive until it receives the breath from God at the time of birth. So, aborting that parasite is the right thing to do. And that there's nothing wrong with it, because life does not begin, so you're not killing anybody, you're not murdering anybody. It's just as simple as that. That's confirmation bias. And when you use the Bible to try to make a point that is contrary to what the Bible actually is teaching about things like abortion, you've stretched it way beyond control. The other terminology that's used frequently is called selective confirmation. So if you make a point or a statement and somebody says, well, you better back that one up, you go to the internet, you go to an encyclopedia, you go to a book you read or a magazine article or whatever, and you try to find support for the position that you just took. And oftentimes you could find it. You could go back to Dr. Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, and where he very definitively said that human beings are only have 10 or 15 years to live before the population outpaces our ability to feed itself. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. But his quote, that could be one of those things that someone who is desperate to prove a point is going to rely on to say, hey, look, there's my confirmation right there, and that's confirmation bias, that's selective confirmation. This is important, I think, because if we look around at what's going on in the America today, in our great country, Orange Man, yeah, we'll see about that. We're dealing with record inflation. We're dealing with supply shortages that are hitting us at the supermarket, at the gas pumps, guys that are driving diesel vehicles. Last I heard, there's only about 25 days left of diesel reserves. That could be pretty significant, because that's going to have a ripple effect or a cascade effect on the supply chain issues, on transportation in general. Railroads run on diesel. Most of our trucking companies run on diesel. Our farms run on diesel. Just one of those things that is out there that we need to be concerned about. And where did these supply shortages come from? Well, a lot of it has to do with inflation. A lot of it has to do with current domestic policy being pushed by the current administration that's saying, well, we need to do away with fossil fuels, and we need to be making this big, huge leap into electric vehicles. Well, until they can perfect the technology, until it's readily available, it just ain't going to work. And I don't think we're going to be able to see an effective infrastructure to support electric vehicles, especially when they want to ban them entirely in certain states. So we're dealing with inflation, we're dealing with supply shortages, we're dealing with the crisis at our southern border, immigration, terrorists being allowed entry into our country, or they're just looking the other way while they walk across the river or jump the fence or whatever they're doing. Fentanyl, that's a big killer. That's coming across our southern border. It's being made oftentimes with components from China. We've got a crime wave going on in pretty much every single one of our Democrat-run cities. It's out of control. It's not safe to walk the streets in Washington, D.C., in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. It's a crisis right now. We're fighting a proxy war against Russia using the Ukrainians, and that's unfortunate. and I've heard an awful lot of things about that. I've got a good friend that's from Ukraine, and she she doesn't trust any world leaders at all to do the right thing for the people in Ukraine. And it's not the people in Ukraine that are causing this war. This is the leadership, if you can call it that, in places like Russia, even in Ukraine, and here in the United States. The proxy war is very dangerous because it's put us on the precipice of nuclear war. There's been accusations already made by the Russian government that there's going to be some sort of a dirty bomb thing going off in Ukraine, and the Russians are going to blame the Ukrainians, and if there is a dirty bomb explosion, the Ukrainians are going to blame the Russians, and you know what? We'll never know exactly what happened, because it may be too late by then, because one of those kinds of provocations is going to start and escalate the most dangerous place we've been in the history of nuclear warfare. To continue along about what may be important to consider in 2 weeks when we go to the polls, if you haven't been already, I tend to wait until actual voting day so I can show up in person and kind of watch my ballot being taken care of properly, but that's up to you. All this critical racism theory that's being taught in school and then denied by teachers' unions and teachers themselves and all that, well, the parents are in an uproar about that. And who is behind the support for this kind of educational indoctrination for our young children? Well, it's certainly not the conservatives, certainly not the GOP. It's those other guys. Yeah, it's the Democrats that are doing it. All this nonsense about the gender fluidity and the surgical interventions to remove certain body parts of one sex or another to make them think they're really something that they're not, that's being pushed in our schools right now. And parents are upset about it, and they're pushing back really hard. A lot of all that belief nonsense right now is all related to what I call confirmation bias. They make a statement, they make a proposition, they make a policy, and they run around like crazy looking for confirmation for it. They've got a great partner in the media, especially the mainstream media, cable news channels like CNN and MSNBC, and trending even lately a little bit from Fox News, and that's kind of disheartening. I actually went and looked when we were doing some research for this particular video, trying to make sure that at least somebody was reporting on what's going on in Ukraine right now with the 101st Airborne being on the Romanian border and the threats of nuclear whatever, dirty bombs and all that kind of stuff. It's not being reported. They're keeping the American people in the dark. You can find the information if you go out to alternate news sources. You can find it out there, but you're not going to see it on Fox. You're not going to see it on MSNBC, NBC, CBS, ABC. It's just not there. And I'm concerned about that because that does everything to confirm this whole nonsense of confirmation bias. We've got 2 weeks to go. Consider what I've just said about confirmation bias. Consider the issues that we're facing as a country. Vote your conscience. vote your ethics, but get out there and make sure you vote. This is the Prepared Suburbanite, reminding you to be prepared always, and I'll see you all on the next video.